Hey friend, this episode is all about the 5 phrases that most podcasters use that they don't realize are hurting their reach and their growth on their podcast. So if you want to know which ones they are and if you may be guilty of using them, you have to keep watching. My name is Anna Xavier and this is the Podcast Space, a practical podcast but kind of imperfect so that it helps you stay motivated on your podcast journey. Let's go. Okay, so I have these 5 phrases for you, but I'm going to start with the most common one that I think that potentially sets up most podcasters for failure. And this is one that I've been hearing commonly through my over 10 years of experience working with podcasters. And that is that my podcast is for everyone. This is potentially something that can help you when you're starting, when you're really overwhelmed and you don't know where to start. And, if anything, just start with someone in mind. It could change. But saying something like, my podcast is for everyone, let's take this podcast for example. If you were to say, Anna, is this podcast for everyone? I would say, no, this podcast is not for everyone. My ideal audience is someone who is a small business owner or an entrepreneur who really loves the idea of making the world a better place, whether that's by creating content that educates their community or their business idea really makes the world a better place. Now, I'm not talking about, for instance, technology. I rarely cover it. I only cover it if it really has to do with content strategy or if the guest in front of me has an amazing story that is kind of correlated with technology or if they're using technology in a really cool way. But I won't be talking about lights and cameras and the setup that I have, that's not what I want. So if you're saying your podcast is for everyone, you're not really going to be able to niche down. And what that means is to find a community that you can serve time and time again. To say that your audience is everyone is also to say that you will have no clue of what to talk about. I will say that 3 months from now, 6 months from now, you'll really struggle to create content for that person that you can't tell what they're here for, what they're coming to you for. So the first thing you got to say is, what is this person that is coming here listening to my podcast want from me? But also, how am I uniquely qualified to help them solve that problem? It may be helpful to listen to previous episodes. For instance, episode 4, the 7 types of podcast goals that you can set on your show. It's super helpful to understand what are you trying to achieve. And let's go into the second one, and that is, I am not experienced enough to talk about fill in the blank. Now, I get this question all the time. I get this question actually on my DMs from someone who said they got shut down. Somebody was like, well, you're not qualified to talk about this. I want to talk about this because I think that I've worked with clients with, honestly, every podcast idea possible. I've worked with realtors, people who are business consultants, senior living experts, people who were doing a show about dating, health consultants, you name it. Honestly, some shows were based off their skill set and what they knew, but other times it was an exploratory podcast. And an exploratory podcast means that you're pretty much discovering the topic as your listener is discovering it with you. And so it's totally fine. Again, something that you can't claim to be an expert on and then figure it out as it goes. Obviously, that's not something that you should do. But if your approach, if your angle for the show is, hey, join me as we discover X, that's perfect. You don't need to be an expert in order to start your show. Also, you do not need to be media trained in order to start a podcast. And honestly, I can talk about it because I am a former journalist. I actually had media training. And I've seen amazing, amazing hosts that were never trained. They just kind of picked it up and they learned it by themselves and they were absolutely phenomenal. So if that's something that is holding you back, please don't. Talk to me on Instagram at the Podcast Space and tell me where you're stuck. But again, if you're a doctor and you want to be talking about, health stuff, makes sense. But if you are a common person who's trying to give health advice, maybe you want to do a disclaimer about the fact that it's your experience and that the content on that show is not to be used as medical advice, by the way, because in the US, I know that a lot of my audience members are not from the US. If you're in the US, you could be sued. That's a big thing here. So I want to invite you to also consider, if I'm not an expert, who is it? Can I do some research online and create an episode around it, or invite someone who is an expert and hear about them? I know a ton of people who wanted to break into specific industries, and that's something that I talk about on episode 4, actually, how you can use your podcast in order to get your goals. And one of them is, in fact, career switching. You can learn about a whole industry by talking to other people and becoming an expert by just kind of like absorbing and implementing some of the things they do. They talk about, I mean. So that's something that a lot of people kind of get stuck on and don't ever launch their podcast because they're like, I don't know what to do. They're like, well, you have Google. You have Daddy Google. You can search for it. And then this is what? Number 3, I need to wait until the perfect time for fill in the blanks. Honestly, the amazing podcast ideas that I've heard through the years that were never, ever, ever implemented because the person said, oh, I need to wait a bit more until, or I need to leave this job. Especially like, I need to find more time for the perfect time where I can actually dedicate time. Like, honestly, 90% of the people that told me, like, I need to wait for the perfect time just never launched an idea. So do you want to be part of that 90%, or do you want to launch it, or, you know, like, work with me to figure out, like, how to launch your podcast? What is it that you want to talk about? Worst case scenario, just launch it. A lot of clients are really afraid of how, like, they're going to be perceived, how their ego is going to be hurt by, like, their peers by looking at them and say, well, you're starting a podcast, that's a new skill, and you're kind of like probably going to suck. And a lot of times people are just so afraid of that judgment that they never try something that could be like amazing and career changing and really impactful. So I want to invite you, stop waiting for the perfect time. Another perfect example, quote unquote, of this is, I have to wait until I get home to record this podcast. I gotta go to my perfect space and I gotta go and, you know, like set up my whole thing. And sometimes, a lot of times, and shout out to my podcast Friends and Trends member, Ingvild. She said that the other day she just recorded something in her kitchen when she was in the middle of something. I was like, yes, don't wait for the perfect time to record a podcast episode, right? If you're creating something, you can snag your microphone or something and just record it as you are kind of like having that idea. Something else. I purposely did not put any makeup today because that is honestly, for women, it's such a big turnoff. So many women say, I gotta go and get my hair done. I gotta go and, you know, like put on makeup, change my clothes. This is actually something, I think I'm wearing the same thing as I recorded the last time, the previous episode last week. And I was like, you know what? I'm not gonna change because that defeats the purpose. We have limited energy. And so I am not gonna waste that energy on, getting that done. Also, by the way, if you hear noises, we have contractors right outside our house. And I was like, well, I have to record the podcast right now before the light gets bad. So I just, you know, if you hear some weird noises, that's them. It's life. It happens. It's not about creating the perfect episode. It's about moving forward. And again, so on brand for my podcast. What else do I have here? Oh, another one on the I have to wait until the perfect. It's sometimes like I have to wait until I get more experience to invite my dream guest. I cannot tell you. Like the opposite of that would be the one podcast client that I had that I worked with like many, many years ago, way before I launched the podcast space. And this person had never been a podcast host. He actually had a lot of like social anxiety in performing for cameras and stuff like that. And he right away invited, literally for episode 1. I'm not gonna like obviously give too many personal details, but like people who were like CEOs of big companies. And he was so nervous. And this is just so bad. Like he had to drink a lot before each episode. And again, not in my company. I had no say. I just had to run the show. And it was just so hard to see him. Like, he didn't have an idea of what the show's identity was. He didn't get enough practice. So that's literally the opposite. This is not going to happen to you. But for most people, run 20 episodes before you invite your favorite guest or someone who you've been admiring for a while. A lot of times people actually feel super excited to be invited on podcasts. So why not do it? Invite them on the show, especially, and this is a tip, if your show is still small and you're worried about not having enough downloads on your show and not having, a big presence, what you may want to do is to make sure that that person, normally bigger guests have times on the year where they will go on quote unquote podcast tours, which are just, they set up a bunch of interviews to just maximize their time. They're trying to get a lot of traction in a short period of time. So they may guest on 20 podcasts in a month, or 40 or 50 or 100, whatever it is. There's a lot of people that will go on these really intense tours because they have a product launch, a new book, a new course, whatever it is. They may have their own podcast out. So reach out to these people at the time, or just say, hey, I would love to have you. Also look into your network. A lot of times we could really tap into people because there's someone. I don't believe that in the podcast world, there's something as the 7 degrees of separation. I believe that actually there's only 3. I realized that I was connected to a lot of famous people because they were guests on podcasts of people that I actually knew or somehow was connected to. So that's one of the biggest tips of this episode, is that check in your network. And then, I cannot launch a podcast because I can't pay someone. I need to hire help, and I need to make enough money so that I can pay. The amount of times that I get people who are hey, I want to learn from you. Can I work with you on, a bartering basis where, I trade my services for your coaching? Or maybe someone is just out of college and they really want the training, and you can provide a specific outline of learning that will learn, or maybe they're changing a career. I also know someone who is freelancing, trying to get into an industry, and they were trying to tap into the one of the guests' networks, and so they knew that the guests of these podcasts that were just super valuable, so they wanted to start gathering a lot of connections from being in the host's team. So they wanted to do that. All right, we're jumping into number 4 of the 5 expressions that really will hurt your podcast growth, and that is, I cannot afford it, I can invest. Basically, this is as old as, time. Someone saying, I want to grow my podcast, but I cannot invest. And 9 times out of 10, when someone says I cannot invest, what they're saying is they don't trust themselves to make that jump or to make the commitment. And that saddens me because for most podcasters, they spend so many hours trying to avoid paying, for instance, paying for the paid membership or paying for the pro service. I will always remember this person who was telling me Anna, I cannot afford paying for a scheduling software for my social media. So they would spend hours trying to make things to work around it, and they were so stressed. And I was like, hey, have you ever actually looked into pay for just the minimum one and just try to work around it? And they were like, oh no, I just thought, I just can't afford it. So they didn't even put any effort into it. And I was like, well, how much energy are you spending just trying to hack the system? For most people, you can hack sometimes and try to find better ways other times. But for most times, a hack will never really provide you a long-term solution. And that's what I see. Podcasters are always the type of people who are very crafty, very scrappy, always trying to find ways to save money. I get it, especially if you're not making money with your podcast yet. It's scary to invest, but at the same time, the amount of time and energy that you're going to spend trying to do everything else is just going to burn you out faster. So figure out what is a commitment that you can make today that is going to help you grow your show. I coach clients on these podcast power hours. We meet for 1 hour. We go through all the questions they have, and then they go and they implement them. that's perfect. If you can commit to like long-term coaching, that's something that you can do. Or just considering like the yearly payment and you pay it in once. Sometimes do that, where I try to make some software pay for the year, and sometimes it saves me $200 in a year, which is a considerable amount of money. So don't discard the idea of, trying to pay for like the year, because sometimes it's worth it. Or just ask for promo codes. A lot of times podcasters have it because they're like affiliates. If you want to know some of mine, I can give you. I don't have a ton because that's not the bulk of my strategy, but sometimes I have a few things. So, ask away. All right, and number 5, my audience is too small to, fill in the blanks. A lot of times podcasters wait until they have like bigger numbers to invite bigger guests, as I was mentioning earlier, or even sometimes to talk about topics that are like, oh, I can't talk about that now because I want to talk about this topic when my show has like, 300 downloads per episode instead of now I only have 100 or 50 or whatever it is. Your content is evergreen. Maybe the person who is listening to you now is the person who will do business with you, needed that type of episode, and will eventually help you pay for that podcast, right? And then, also look at it from this perspective. And I want you to consider also listening to episode 10, and that is the 10 signs that showcase that you're podcasting from a place of fear. A lot of times we're looking into the scarcity mindset that is, oh, if I do this now, then I won't be able to do X in the future. The listeners you have today are not the same listeners you will have, 3 months from now, 6 months from now. I work with clients to recycle content because 1, we just think that topic is relevant. And 2nd, maybe the person who was listening 3 months ago did not listen to that episode. And it's an opportunity to remind them, but also to just be clever in the way that we repurpose the content. It's not like, hey, we've done this once, kind of like wash your hands, that topic is done, we're not covering it again. And so while your audience is small, don't say things like, my audience is still small, I cannot invest in video podcasting. My audience is too small, I cannot invite my bigger guests. My audience is too small, I can't commit enough time. Because in your audience, you'll have what's called the super fans, and these are people that like are so in love with who you are and your content that they are constantly recommending your content to friends, peers, family, whoever has that one question that they know that you answer. These are the best people. So I want to invite you to consider these 5 phrases that you need to scrap from your vocabulary when you're podcasting, and those are: my podcast is for everyone. I'm not experienced enough to talk about topic X. I need to wait in the perfect timing until I can fill in the blanks. I cannot afford it, or I cannot invest. And my audience is too small. I won't say that I have none of these thoughts ever. Trust me, I do have them too. But the truth is to remember your why. Why are you podcasting? Why are you doing this? Why are you committing weekly time to creating this content? I just want to remind you that is what matters. If your podcast is a tool for you to have fun and grow and develop yourself, don't come at it from a place of fear where you're like, oh, I can't do this or I can't do that. Just like, why not? Why not me? Right? So be adventurous, try new things. I want to invite you to try something new every week. I do the same with this podcast. This week I decided to not record with makeup and just kind of do it a bit more on the go. And in the meantime, my chair slid down, so I had to put myself back up. This podcast is just like a little joy. But I want to remind you that, try to focus on what really matters. And I'm here to help you on that journey. If you love these podcasts, please rate and review it on any podcast platform that you're, consuming content on. But I want to also invite you to do something that I started doing, which is called Good Podcast Karma Mondays. And that is where I just remember to go on my podcast platform and rate and review the podcasts that I listen to on a weekly basis, or maybe sometimes podcasts from friends that I kind of like forgot that are like, oh yeah, oops, they have a podcast, and I go and recommend their podcast. So make sure that you join me on there. And for everything else, you can tag me your wins and talk to me on the podcast space. And obviously for anything else, thepodcastspace.com/podcast. That's where everything and more that I talked about on this episode will be there, because let's be real, there's always so much good stuff to talk about that sometimes I forget. So make sure that you go on the website and you'll be able to get all the resources that I've talked about. Until next week, have a wonderful, wonderful day, and I'll see you there. Bye.